Hello, and welcome to Anime Audio Commentary. Today I'll be commenting on Episode 4 of Cyberpunk Edgerunners. If you'd like to watch along, then start watching now. So I do have to admit, the first time I saw this opening scene, I was really, intrigued, because it's very clear that there's something important going on, but it's not exactly clear what. I think it's a really good way to hook somebody in. So I guess just to sort of rub it in our faces a little bit, we're not resolving anything in that little cold open, we're just sort of going back to business as usual in Night City. Presumably the group, planning a heist or something, or scoping things out. It seems as though they're kind of dealing with the fallout from stealing that car, They've basically sort of alerted everybody, and therefore Arasaka's playing it kind of safe. It's not exactly clear why Main and his crew are being tasked with snooping on Tanaka, but the fact that he's already sort of involved with David is kind of interesting in a, boy, that's a coincidence sort of way. I do think it's interesting that these little scene transitions, have, screen tearing and stuff like that. It's a bit of an interesting thing, stylistically. So speaking of interesting, it's kind of unfortunate that David's basically just sitting around not doing anything because, they don't have any gigs currently. And it's not like David is hurting for money or anything, but, he's just sort of like that kind of young kid where, you have to be doing something all the time. And I can certainly sympathize with that. But, I think Main had the right idea. Desperate is an ugly look. So it's interesting that David is sort of being used as a bit of a messenger. It's not a big job or perhaps a particularly important job, but it's something where he doesn't really have any oversight. He's on his own, doing his own thing, and he's actually basically delivering for another member of the gang, in this case Pilar. And he's not somebody we've seen too terribly much of. I'm not so well versed in Cyberpunk to know what sort of class he represents, other than like a sort of tech specialist that's not also a netrunner. I'm sure there's a term for it, but I don't know what it is offhand. Now, something I think is kind of interesting here is that, aside from Rebecca opening the door with a gun drawn and a finger on the trigger, a lot of these locations we see, I believe, are places you can see in the actual game itself, even if they aren't of the same significance, if that makes any sense. So, Pilar, it seems, got a nice new set of upgrades, new hands. And seeing as how he refers to them as cyber hands, I get the feeling that they're far more specialized than they would initially seem. And I guess despite being siblings, Pilar and Rebecca, they don't always see eye to eye. Rebecca, as always, is pretty quick on the trigger. I do like her, though, There's something about shooting first and asking questions later that I do enjoy. Of course, David doesn't really have any attention to spare for her. He's more focused on Lucy. And in a weird sort of twist, Lucy is, I guess, relegated to babysitting duty. She sort of has to wrangle David, train him, show him the ropes, a bunch of stuff that she probably doesn't care too much to do. So once again, we're sort of, I guess, informed of David's imminent cyberpsychosis, seeing as how he's basically a twig, Lucy herself says 1 or 2 more implants and you'll freak out. But, one would think if he was going to, that Sandevistan already would have done so. Ooh. Yeah, so this is one of the things I also like about Cyberpunk. There's a whole lot of violence, and very little of it is censored or toned down. I mean, David just took like a solid crack to the skull. That is not nothing. Now, interestingly, David's asking the cogent question here, why would a netrunner actually have to run? And Lucy says, it's a stamina thing, but I don't know how physical stamina would necessarily impact net running, seeing as how that's more of a mental thing, if anything. It is interesting that really only Rebecca seems to sort of hang out with David, at least at this early juncture. I mean, Maine does teach him some stuff here and there, seeing as how they're both chrome junkies, for want of a better term. But man, it is kind of interesting in a sad way, seeing as how David's basically stuck with these guys. I mean, he really is getting a crash course in basically everything, driving, exercise, all sorts of essential skills he'll need on the job. Unfortunately, crash course is sometimes a little more literal than one would like. I do think it's interesting that things are sort of happening non-linearly. You keep flashing back between, I guess, different lessons. It is interesting, however, that Lucy's making it pretty clear that, she doesn't really want anything to do with Pilar. Perhaps indicating that, David has a chance. I mean, that's sort of, I would think something that was sort of hinted at by that whole moon thing. And I guess if nothing else, Maine seems to think that David should take a crack at her. I mean, I guess to David's credit, he's taking everything pretty darn seriously. Exercise, working with Maine, trying to get with Lucy. So it does seem like David really is truly improving if you can swipe like a whole train car's worth of chips that quickly. Yeah, unfortunately though, despite all the progress he's making, it does seem like David's just kind of lacking in the fact that, he's almost entirely flesh and blood, and he's kind of a kid too. I feel like especially if you're going to try and deal with like actual Arasaka mercenaries and people like that, you'd have to have at least a little bit more hardware. So even though David's trying to work with firearms here, it doesn't seem like he's really all that capable of it, considering what happened with his mom. That's not something that comes up too frequently, but it's rather unfortunate just that it happened and that it's still an issue. Now this is a scene I think is particularly interesting because all these gang members, they are particularly ugly people on account of all their cybernetics, and they seem like rather nasty individuals too, seeing as how they just sort of had Rebecca in a refrigerator like that. But for as augmented and screwed up as they are, they don't really seem to be a match for Maine's gang. It's also interesting that there's maybe not like a schism in the group, but Lucy's whole business with the moon is, something she keeps to herself, and Maine is sort of like the de facto leader of the group. That he doesn't know. It's not like super important, but that she would tell David is kind of telling. So as it turns out, that little jogging exercise, that was with the training wheels on. Lucy's not playing around anymore. She gave him basically the bare minimum. And it would seem as though David has decided that in order to meet this minimum easily, augmetic lungs are the way to go here. The normal flesh and blood lungs aren't cutting it anymore, so, he has to bust open his rib cage and replace them, which to me seems like an unconscionably horrifying process. Like, I understand that my flesh and bone is not everlasting and is indeed pretty fallible, but I don't know. I don't think I could ever go through with an augmentation like this, just hacking off a functional body part and replacing it, even if it is, markedly better. I mean, I guess it doesn't help that all the sequences of David getting new augmetic bits are, rather visceral and disturbing. So unfortunately, Pilar here seems to be violating one of the cardinal rules of living in a city, If there's like a homeless guy doing something, you just give him a wide berth, don't interact with them. Literally, things can only go bad, Best case scenario, there's no interaction. Worst case scenario, something happens. And, Pilar's getting all in this guy's business when he's trying to take a leak. I guess the worst part is he's commenting on the augmented status of the guy's, you-know-what. And, whether or not that was the catalyst, he saw fit to just, pulp Pilar's head, which now puts the cold open into perspective. All those little glittering droplets. Yeah, that was, blood and brain matter and all that. And what's worse, this guy's like a real cyber psycho, too. It's not like there's a whole lot of morality going on in Night City, but for the guy to just, not think twice and blow his head up like that, that's something. And it would seem as though Pilar's not enough. This guy wants more blood. And I guess David's just sort of shell-shocked by the whole endeavor. He doesn't really have his wits about him. And if not for Maine's intervention, he would certainly be dead too. Now, I do feel a little bad for Rebecca here. Because, I feel like she's not especially unhappy about her brother being shot like that, so much as it was somebody else and not her. Because, the two of them never really seemed to get along what little we'd seen them interact. But, I guess you do sort of have to favor your own flesh and blood over some random hobo on the street. Unfortunately, for a random hobo, he does seem fairly resilient. And what little I know about the tabletop game, I don't think being a cyber psycho in and of itself makes you resilient to a superhuman degree, A bullet to the head will kill you whether you're of sound mind or insane. And I guess that sort of proved to be the case here and now. Well, I guess I take that back. One bullet to the head wasn't quite enough. As it turns out, you have to remove the whole head. And I guess, there we have it too. Lucy's mad, I guess, about that she lost the opportunity. It really is like a short sequence where everything just sort of hit the fan like this, but probably the worst thing about it was the senselessness of it, None of this needed to happen. And you could make the argument that Pilar was kind of asking for it by goading the cyber psycho, but on the other hand, maybe killing somebody isn't a commensurate response to them watching you urinate in public. I mean, I guess, if nothing else, this just sort of demonstrates that Night City is really a place you don't want to spend any time if you can avoid it. So I guess predictably things are going to be kind of tense. What do you say to somebody who's barely an acquaintance? Like, oh darn, our friend got his head blown up. Man, that kind of sucks, right? I mean, nonetheless, David seems to be making a go of it, trying to talk to her, I guess, to venture the conversation onto stable ground here. I guess when in doubt, talk about the moon. Shame about the cloud cover and all that. So it's very interesting that Lucy has decided to be honest, or at least perhaps pretending to be honest. Like, yeah, I was telling the truth about that whole moon business. And it's not like she's not, I guess, trying to tease David a little bit, saying like, oh, I might be lying now too. But it seems to me she's just kind of playing games here. It's, I don't know, I think it's that she doesn't really know how to be sincere. And that's something that I think is kind of like a big problem that a lot of people face. People will make fun of you for being sincere, so you sort of have to mask sincerity with irony. And when everybody does that, like, the world as a whole is just kind of worse off, because, like, if nothing is sincere, nothing really matters. It's rather unfortunate. And perhaps it's, a little bit of foreshadowing, but Lucy is saying, you make your name by how you die, not how you live. And that is sort of like a running theme in Cyberpunk and Night City. It's, what's the saying? It's better to burn out than fade away. So it seems like Lucy has decided to actually be sincere here. Against all odds, she has taken a liking to David, and knowing the occupational hazards of their profession, she doesn't want what is, in all likelihood, inevitable to happen. But, what can she do? What can any of them do, really? Alright, well that's it for this episode. If you've enjoyed it, then by all means, tune in for the next one. See you, Space Cowboy.